All right, well, tonight is where things get a little more, I won't say difficult, but I'll say unfamiliar. I told the story in church, I think, how when I was a kid, I was going to read the whole Bible all the way through, cover to cover. And, Genesis has all those stories that are familiar about Abraham and Isaac and the ark and the garden, and all. Genesis is a pretty easy read. Exodus also, that familiar story that's been made into movies, and Exodus is also familiar, but you turn the page and get to the next couple of books, Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and that's where a lot of folks who make the commitment to read through the Bible run into things slow down and things don't go as quickly because they are books that are very different from Genesis and Exodus. And part of it is because they switch mode frequently. They're books that they'll be talking about a story part of what is happening with the children of Israel in the desert and their wanderings. Then we'll have chapters of laws on things that seem pretty obscure and odd. And then we'll go back to a narrative for a while, and then we'll have more laws about some other topic that seems odd, and then we'll have a description of the tabernacle, and not just a description, but page after page after page of very precise measurements and materials. And then we'll go back to a narrative, and it's kind of, you skip from one kind of literature to the next, sort of back and forth. And it can be really confusing, and it can be really tough sledding because some of the material is so strange. It seems so foreign to what we're doing, and it'd be almost like you're reading a novel, and right in the middle of the novel, suddenly there's a cookbook, and it's 20 pages in the middle of the novel, and then you go back to the novel, and then suddenly there's a math book in the middle of that, mathematical facts or maps, and you're like, what kind of book is this? And that's the way you sometimes feel about these books, is there's a jumping from one kind of narrative or one kind of book to another, all sort of just jammed together. And so what I'm going to do tonight is kind of skip around and talk about the narrative part of the story, how the story moves forward, then go back and talk about some of the other sections. Obviously, I'm going to talk about the tabernacle. I'm going to talk about the various holidays or holy days that are instituted in these books. I'm going to talk about some of the laws in different categories: food laws, health laws, property laws, sex laws, all these various things. And I'm going to, instead of just going through Leviticus and then going through Numbers and going through Deuteronomy, I'm going to kind of stick with one genre and then switch to another genre. So let's first get the narrative of what's happening in these books. What's happening with the people of Israel after the Exodus. Because last time we left, they crossed the Red Sea. Pharaoh was regretting his decision to let them go, even after the 10 plagues had devastated Egypt. And the last plague, of course, the plague on the firstborn son in every household. But even right in the middle of that narrative, if you remember, there is a section on this is how you are to celebrate the Passover. This is how you're to remember the Passover, which you can tell it was written long after these events occurred. But the Passover occurs, the Pharaohs let them go, they've crossed over, they've been in the desert, and very quickly there is whining and complaining and grumbling about what are we going to eat, what are we going to drink, what's going to happen to us. And Moses realizes he has the Bible calls them stiff-necked. He has a stiff-necked group of ex-slaves who are almost ready to head back to Egypt. And remembering with somewhat foggy memories, well, at least we ate back then. At least we weren't going hungry and thirsty back then. So we had that last time, and we ended up with talking about the moment that has been immortalized in so many movies of Moses going up to the mountaintop, God giving him the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets, Moses coming down, and as we kind of ended up the last time, he comes down and back into the valley, and what's going on? They're going nuts, right? I mean, they've gone amok. And specifically, what are they doing?
They made an idol.
Yeah, they've made a golden idol out of in the shape of a calf, and they are saying this, pointing to the calf. This is Yahweh. It's not that they've switched gods. It's that they felt they've got to have a physical idol. They've got to have a physical representation of God. And in Egypt, all the idols were animals, or half man, half animal. And so they've made this calf, this golden calf. And Aaron, Moses' brother, has said, this is Yahweh. This is the God who led you out of Egypt. And we're going to have a festival and worship Yahweh, but pointing at the golden calf. So, I think about the 10 Commandments, it's not so much breaking the first commandment as the second commandment. Making this graven image. And we talked about how when Moses sees this, he hears the noise, and he thinks it's not battle, it's a party. It's singing and dancing is what he hears. And he goes down and they're having this sort of worship experience around the idol. And he's so overcome with anger, grief, frustration that he throws down the tablets, smashes them. And he goes up to his brother and says, What did they do to you to make you do this? And that's, of course, Aaron, I think one of the funny yet awfully tragic parts where Aaron says, oh, well, you know these people, you know how difficult they are, and they gave me their golden earrings, and we threw it into the fire, and out came this cat. He skipped a couple of steps there in that explanation, and Moses is furious. He destroys the idol. He grinds it into dust, pours it in the water, makes him drink it. He's furious with the immediate breaking of the very center of what they'd been told to do, which was have a covenant with the unseen God, Yahweh. And they've immediately turned away, and they're doing all these things that are forbidden. And God is angry, and Moses intercedes on behalf of the people, and we know that there's peace. He gets new tablets, and they continue on this journey. Now, when we get to Leviticus, I'm going to skip the Leviticus and go to one of the parts of the story that we find actually in Numbers. Because sometimes you think, how long can it take to get from Egypt to Canaan? It's not that far. I think, how does it take 40 years to get from Egypt to Canaan? It's not a 40-year journey. Scholars estimate that if you, even with a large caravan of people stopping with children and animals and everything else, a month maybe would be how long it would take to make this journey. Maybe a month. And we're talking 40 years. Well, how does that come about? Well, they get to the verge of entering Canaan. And get to Numbers 13. And this is actually maybe a story that's a little bit familiar. Numbers 13. They've been on this, it's only been a matter of weeks. They've come to the verge of crossing the Jordan River, crossing into this promised land. Numbers 13. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites, and these are their names, and we have the 12 tribes here, and who went from each tribe. And so they say, they're spies. They say, go report on Canaan before we cross the Jordan, before we go into this promised land. And 13:17. Moses sent them to explore Canaan. He said, go up through the Negev, onto the hill country, see what the land is like. whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or are they fortified? How's the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees on it? Do your best to bring back some fruit of the land, because it was the season for grapes. So basically, they've never, they were all born in Egypt. They, with a few exceptions, none of these people have ever been anywhere except Egypt. They've been told to go to this new land. They don't know what it's like. They don't have any, aerial photographs of the place. They have no idea. So they go to spy it out, check it out. So they send 12 men across the Jordan to check out the land. And it says they went in there, they found some grapes, and notice how rich it is. Verse 23, when they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. I mean, there's lots of bounty. The grapes are so plentiful. They've got a giant bunch of grapes, pomegranates, figs. They spy out for 40 days. So they come back, 13:26. They come back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh, in the desert of Paran. They reported to them and the whole assembly and showed them the fruit, and they gave Moses this account. 13:27. We went into the land to which he sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's the fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. In other words, this is not unoccupied territory. There's all kinds of people already living there. And Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there." The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. The Nephilim are the giants. These are really large people. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. We looked the same to them. So 10 of the 12 say, it's impossible. There's no way we can take possession of this land. The people who live there, they're big, they're strong, they have fortified cities, they're numerous. It's impossible. Chapter 14. That night all the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole assembly said to them, "If only we'd died in Egypt, or in this desert. Why is Yahweh bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." So, it's only been a few weeks, at most maybe 6-7 weeks, after the escape from slavery, and they're ready to say, "Let's go back. Let's go back. We'll say, we're sorry, we'll be your slaves again. Take us, chain us up, put us to work. We'll go back to slavery." And at that, verse 5, Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who explored the land, tore their clothes. Remember, anytime you see in Judaism, tearing your clothes is a sign of remorse and grief. And you tear your clothes as a sign of anguish. Tore their clothes. and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He'll lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey. He'll give it to us. Don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land. We'll swallow them up. Their protection is gone. The Lord's with us. Don't be afraid of them." So the minority report, two guys, Joshua and Caleb, said, basically, think about what God did. God got us out of bondage. Think about all the miracles. Think about the plagues. Think about the parting of the Red Sea. Think about everything that we've seen God do. And that was against the most powerful nation in the area, Egypt. Why don't you trust that the same God who delivered you out of bondage, who did those mighty miracles in Egypt, why don't you trust that that same God, if He said we can take the land, then we should believe Him and we should go take the land? But they're 2 voices out of 12. So they give their minority report, and here's the response of the crowd, 14:10. The whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the miraculous signs I've performed among them? I'll strike them down with a plague and destroy them. I'll make you into a nation greater and stronger than them." God is saying, I'm tired of these people. And so He says basically, just like I started with Aaron and built up a nation, well, I'll start with you, Moses. We'll start over. I'll send a plague on these whining, faithless, bickering, stiff-necked people, and we'll start all over with you, Moses, and your descendants. But Moses makes the case, and he basically says, think about your reputation, God. He says, verse 14, 15, "If you put these people to death all at one time, the nations who've heard the report about you will say, 'Yahweh was not able to bring these people into the land He promised. He slaughtered them in the desert.'" He appeals to God's reputation. And basically he says, "This is who you are, Lord." 17, "Let the Lord's strength be displayed, as you've declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion." In other words, this is who you are. And of course, a lot of scholars said, when God said, "I'm just going to wipe them out," was He serious there, or was He waiting to see what Moses would say? But God says, "All right, I'm not going to destroy them. But I'm not going to destroy them." But verse 20, the Lord replied, "I've forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who's treated me with contempt will ever see it. Because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I'll bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route of the Red Sea." Basically, then he continues, verse 27, "How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I've heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. Tell them, as surely as I live, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. In this desert your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more." That's important. Every one of you 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census, who's grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hands to make your own, except Caleb and Joshua. So, as the people have come out of bondage, those 20 and over, he says, you're going to die in the desert. Only your children, only those 20 and under will actually see the promised land, with 2 exceptions, Joshua and Caleb. the two spies who spoke up and said, we can do it. This is why there's 40 years of wandering. It's 40 years of wandering so that that entire generation dies before their descendants, their children and grandchildren, cross over the Jordan into the promised land. Now, so why does it take so long? This is why it takes so long. And it's because the people, are so lacking in faith, so willing to throw in the towel, so willing to go back to Egypt and back into slavery. This is not the group that's going to take the land and take possession of Canaan, the promised land. Just to kind of put an exclamation point on, he says in verse 31, as for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I'll bring them into the land to enjoy the land you've rejected. But your bodies will fall in the desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you'll suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. I'll surely do these things to this wicked community, which is banded together against me. They'll meet their end in the desert. Here they'll die. So, we have 40 years of wandering. Now, let's talk about a couple other things that happened during this 40 years of wandering. Go over a few chapters to Numbers chapter 20. The impatience and the rebellion of the people is a constant theme in these books. But here's one. It's maybe not the most important story, but in terms of stories that are that connective tissue that take us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, this is an interesting story. It's actually Numbers 21. Okay, Numbers 21, and again we have the people grumbling and whining and complaining. Numbers 21. Look at verse 4. So they're wandering around in the desert. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no bread. There's no water. We detest this miserable food. What's the miserable food they're detesting? The manna. They're tired of it. Every day it's the same thing. Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. And they bit the people, and many Israelites died. People came to Moses and said, we sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away. So Moses prayed for the people. You're like, oops, sorry. So the Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who's bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake. He made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. And when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, he lived. So, why would I mention that? Well, okay, because this little story about the bronze snake on a pole comes back into play a couple of other places. We're going to move into a book we haven't gotten to yet, just for a couple of verses. Go to 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18. 2 Kings 18. We'll get to this later, but this is a kind of a summary of some of the deeds of Hezekiah, one of the kings of Judah. We'll get to him in a few weeks, but it's telling us what Hezekiah did when became king when he was 25. He reigned 29 years. And here just has in 2 Kings 18, verse 3. These are some of the deeds of Hezekiah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. He removed the high places, in other words, places of idol worship, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. These, again, are places where they worship pagan gods and false gods. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. See what they had done? They turned it into an idol. They took this thing and turned it into a false god. Generations later. So that Hezekiah had to smash it to keep the people from worshiping it. Now, that's not the only place this is mentioned. And if you've ever wondered about a mysterious part of a gospel passage, now you're going to know something that most of your friends and neighbors won't know. John 3 in the New Testament. This is Nicodemus and Jesus. John chapter 3 is when Nicodemus goes to Jesus in the middle of the night. Rabbi, we know you're from God. Nobody could do the miracles you do if he wasn't from God. And then Jesus interrupts Nicodemus and says, you got to be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what? I can't go back in my mother's womb. They have this whole debate. And then Jesus says this to Nicodemus, John 3, starting at verse 10. John 3, starting at verse 10. This is Jesus talking to Nicodemus. You're Israel's teacher, said Jesus, and you don't understand these things? I tell you the truth. We speak of what we know, and we testify to what we've seen. But still you people don't accept our testimony. I've spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one's ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. You may have read that a bunch. Did you ever go, what is this snake? When he says, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert. What's Jesus talking about? He's talking about this. He's talking about the passage we just read here from Numbers, about the snake that was lifted up, that the people who were snake bit looked at the bronze snake and were healed. And Jesus is saying, in the same way that the people were healed at the snake that was lifted up, I will be lifted up. In other words, lifted up on a cross. And those who come to me will be saved. So Jesus uses an analogy about himself and his crucifixion, referring back to what we would think is a rather obscure story from the book of Numbers that we probably haven't paid a whole lot of attention to. So anyway, you can impress your friends with that. So there's lots of, I don't have time to go through all of the little skirmishes and the people continually being difficult and questioning Moses, rebelling against Moses. And over, I say, there's multiple times where Moses is frustrated with the people, God is frustrated with the people. They have these conferences where Moses is like, Lord, your people are driving me nuts. And God says, Moses, your people are driving me nuts. And, they have this sort of back and forth. But at the end, finally, the 40 years play out. And that generation of people over 20 who came out of Egypt, they've all died, with the exception of Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. And it's time to actually cross. So go over to Deuteronomy now for a minute. And we have sort of the end of that era. Deuteronomy 31. And we're told something that's kind of heartbreaking. Deuteronomy 31. It says, Moses, this is Deuteronomy 31, Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I'm now 120 years old. I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. Now, why? You think after all this, well, if Caleb and Joshua get to cross over, I mean, yeah, Moses, he's old, but he's alive, you know. Why didn't he get to cross over? Now go back to Numbers 20. This is kind of a heartbreaking story. This shows that Moses, although a very patient man, even he has limits to his patience. This is another episode of people whining, always whining about, we need water, we need food, why'd you bring us out here? This is a theme throughout. Numbers 20. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin and stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Miriam, Moses' sister. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, oh, if only we died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why'd you bring the Lord's community into this desert? We and our livestock should die here. Why'd you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. I mean, this is going to be this happens over and over and over again. Is this? What does this say about human nature?
Some people that never thought for themselves to begin with, when they were slaves, they just did what they were told. They didn't have any backbone.
Well, any backbone. The Bible says they had stiff necks, though. I mean, we do have a natural tendency to complain, don't we? I mean, there's something about human nature. We just, I don't know, something about the urge to complain and grouse and. You know, it's, I always say and it's not original to me, that, you know, all kinds of things change. People, you know, technology changes, fashion changes, and all science changes, but human nature stays pretty much the same throughout all of human history. And this tendency to continually complain, oh, why did we ever do this? Oh, it would have been better if we hadn't done this. Oh, why'd you talk us into this? This is as fresh as, you know, the newspaper. This is the way people tend to be. And especially, you know, when someone takes leadership, it's very easy to take pot shots at the leader. You know, they take pot shots at Moses all the time and forget, you know, his role in getting them out of bondage. So they're complaining, and so, you know, Moses goes to God, and God says, verse 7, take the staff, you and your brother Aaron, gather the assembly, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it'll pour out its water. You'll bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. So he says, Moses, tell that rock to give you water, and water will come out of the rock. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said, listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of the rock? Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Is that what God told him to do? No. What did God tell him to do? Speak to the rock. Instead he hits it twice with the staff. Which you might say, that's a pretty minor thing, but of course we don't know. I mean, you're assuming Moses is probably not tapping it lightly. He's probably, yeah, you want water out there, you know? So water comes out, and they drink. And here's this verse that just is kind of sad. Verse 12, 2012. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community in the land I give you. In other words, Moses, you're not going to actually cross over into the promised land. And these were called the waters of Meribah. The word Meribah means quarreling. These are the waters of quarreling, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord. So we get back over now, back to Deuteronomy, where Moses says, I'm not crossing over. I'm not going with you. He says, the Lord told me, you're not going to cross over. Now back 31:3. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He'll destroy the nations in front of you and will take possession of the land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Lord said. So, here at the end of Moses' time, he appoints Joshua as his successor. Joshua becomes the new leader here in Deuteronomy 31. And so then, and I won't read all this, but then after he says, I'm not going, Joshua's going to lead you, and then he kind of gives his farewell address, which is Deuteronomy 31, 32, really up through 34. It's Moses saying, reminding them where they've been, reminding them, and of course at this time, this is all people who were 20 and under when they left Egypt, who now, some of them are 60 years old and younger. And he's reminding them, some of them were babies. Some of them don't remember what happened in Egypt, but he's reminding them of everything that happened. He's kind of retelling the story. And he's telling them to be faithful, to trust God. And he also says, but you're gonna probably mess it up. You're gonna you're gonna probably continue to be rebel, and you're gonna fall into idolatry with the people of the land, and you're gonna have to turn to the Lord and seek forgiveness and deliverance. He's kind of telling them you're probably gonna mess up some of the time. And then there's kind of what they call the Song of Moses, which is more of a poem. Then Moses, in chapter 33, gives a blessing to each of the tribes. And then we have this kind of poignant scene in chapter 34. It says, Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. So he's on the east side of the Jordan River. He's looking across the Jordan at the Promised Land. We can see the Promised Land, but he's on the other side of the Jordan. It says, there the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negev, the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Now, seriously, all those names, they're not called that yet. He's calling it by the names of the tribes that will eventually occupy those lands. Again, which tells you, and it would be like, I don't know, it'd be like them talking about the land run here, and and the land run, and then they went right by the First Methodist Church of Broken Arrow, or I mean, talking about a geography of a place that wasn't there yet, and then the horses rode right by, the Best Western. I mean, so that you have to understand all this stuff is written down generations after the events it's recorded. Like you have these little comments like, now at that time the Canaanites were still in the land. Which tells you when this is written down, this is many, many, many generations after the fact that this is being written down. So he showed Moses the land, and he says like from Dan to Gilead, these are Israel names of tribes that haven't even settled yet. But he shows him the whole land, and he says, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When I said, I'll give it to your descendants. I've let you see it with your eyes, but you won't cross over. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab. God buried Moses in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. To this day, no one knows where the grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. And it's told about how now Joshua took over. And this sort of little bit at the end, 34:10. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his officials in his whole land. No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So, when we think of the people of Israel, and the Jewish people who do not accept Jesus as Messiah, who is the biggest superstar in the Jewish faith? It's Moses. Moses is the icon. Now there's others that are, David, Elijah are both also would be up there, but Moses is the man. And it says here, there's nobody like Moses. Nobody who would go into the tent of meeting and talk with God, it said face to face, and come out of the tent glowing because he'd been in the presence of the Lord. There is no one like Moses, is what the book is saying. Now what I've done over these first half of our class, 45 minutes, is tell you the history part of these three books. Now let's go back and some of these other rather odd, not odd, but just unusual things. Take out, for example, this little sheet here. Okay. Go all the way back now to Exodus 35. Because, going back, we have the new stone tablets in 34. After the initial tablets are smashed, we got new stone tablets with the 10 Commandments. And, at the end of that, it talks about Moses' face being radiant. I talked last week about how that mistranslation, they thought he had horns, and he had a glowing face. And we then go from that narrative from chapter 35 through chapter 40 of Exodus, a description of the tabernacle. And this is often where you kind of get bogged down, because it's a very detailed description of how to build a portable worship space. Okay? So instead of us reading all that, and you're of course welcome to read it, but instead of us reading all that, a picture's worth 1,000 words, this is what those chapters are telling them to build, the tabernacle. A tabernacle is an outdoor sanctuary. An outdoor sanctuary is a tabernacle. Because for 40 years, the Israelites, the children of Israel, they are nomadic. When they're in the desert, they're going from place to place to place because they've got herds and flocks and animals, and they got to find, places for their livestock to eat, and they got to find water, and they got to, they travel with the seasons. And so the wandering is a lot of it is traveling with seasons and finding pasture land and finding in the desert a place, finding water. So they're moving around this desert. Wandering is probably not really the best. They're not wandering like you just don't know where you are. They're nomadic. They're traveling. And during that time, there are also rules about worship. And we're going to talk about the rules of worship here in a little bit, about the holidays and the offerings and the sacrifices. But they have to have a place to do worship. And so they have to have a place of worship. And it's called the tabernacle. Matter of fact, if you have I've seen a few churches that have the word tabernacle in their name. If it's an indoor building, that's not accurate, because a tabernacle is an outdoor worship space. At Camp Egan, there's a tabernacle, an open air worship space. So what this was this portable worship space. And you can see from the picture more or less what it looks like, and also from the diagram. Every time they move, this would be packed up and carried to the next place. And there's this sort of outer tent or outer curtains surrounding it. Then there is a place for the burnt offerings. And you see in the picture there, a little smoke billowing out. A place where they would offer animal sacrifice. There's a place, a brazen laver, a place where the priests would wash their hands. There's a place where they would have incense burning. And there is a place that is there, see in the diagram where it says Ark of Covenant and Mercy Seat. This is where the place called the Holy of Holies. There's the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies is that place where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is this box. I say, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know what it looks like. It's a big oblong box about the size of a coffin, basically, on two poles, covered in gold, and on the lid of the box are two angels with their wings spread out, facing each other. And this is the place where inside this box is a jar of manna, as a reminder of what God did in the desert. The rod that budded and turned into a snake, and other artifacts of God's miracles. And it's inside of that Holy of Holies that the offering is made on the Day of Atonement. And we'll talk about the Day of Atonement here in a minute. But this is the portable sanctuary. And this is what Israel worships in from the time of the wander, or the nomadic times in the desert. This is where they worship from this time until when?
Solomon.
Solomon builds the temple. This is their worship space until Solomon. So, we usually date the Exodus, I don't know, maybe somewhere around, we date Abraham 18 to 1900 BC, the Exodus 1400 BC, David 1000 BC. So from the time of the Exodus to the time of Solomon, I'm talking about at least 400 years. So for at least 400 years, this is where they worship. And there's a group who it's their responsibility to pack it up and cart it along to the next place. Who's that group? Who knows? The Levites. All right, the Levites. Because the Levites is one of the 12 tribes, and when they do get to the Promised Land, and they parcel out the land, to all the different tribes, the Levites don't get land, because their income comes from the tabernacle and then later the temple. That's where their income comes, when the people bring their offerings and bring their sacrifices to first to the tabernacle and later to the temple. The Levites, they get their income from the fact they get to keep a chunk of those animals and those grains and those other things. That's how they make a living, as opposed to having land to grow crops on. So the Levites are the ones who carry it around, and a subgroup of Levites is the priests. Say every priest is a Levite, but not every Levite is a priest. Okay? Because remember, Moses and Aaron and Miriam are from this tribe of Levi. And it is the descendants of who that are priests?
Moses.
Not Moses. Aaron. Aaron's descendants is the priestly tribe. So, the descendants of Aaron, the priestly tribe, are a subgroup of the Levites. So the Levites are responsible for the tabernacle, but only those who are the descendants of Aaron are the actual priests. So this is what the tabernacle looks like. And there was different kinds of offerings would be brought there. And they're actually, if you look at Leviticus 6 and 7, okay, Leviticus 6 and 7, actually, you have to go back to Leviticus 5. Leviticus 5, it starts talking about the different offerings. Like 5:14, it talks about the guilt offering. 6:8, the burnt offering. 6:14, the grain offering. 6:24, the sin offering, etc. These different kinds of offerings. And again, without getting too bogged down there, but the basic is different kinds of offerings were brought. You would bring an offering to the tabernacle and later to the temple. Some as just a general way of saying thank you to God. Sometimes because you had sinned and you needed to come and bring a guilt offering, a sin offering. And so these chapters there, I'm not have time to go through all of them. These chapters here in Leviticus 6 and 7 detail the different kinds of offerings that people would bring to the temple or to the tabernacle and later to the temple. So now let's talk about the special days that they would worship. Let's talk about this other insert. And I'm trying to look for a really good graph, and actually this is one that would be used mainly for school activities, so you know when the Jewish kids have to be off school. But it was actually the best one I could find because it's current and it gives us sort of a little capsule of the various holidays. And again, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but these are the holidays that are prescribed in the stories that we read. And the one that we started with was Passover. That's the story we ended with last time. The Passover is for the Jews the biggest holiday. And notice what it says here in the little handout. What does Passover celebrate? The deliverance of the Jewish people from Egypt. The first and the last 2 days are observed as full holidays. There are dietary restrictions against leavened products, such as bread, pastry, pasta, certain legumes, and more, during all 8 days of this holiday. And we've already had Passover this year, 2019. The next time Passover will start will be the evening of April 8th next year, 2020. It always falls around the same time as Easter. Now, where it talks about Passover, Leviticus 23, and this is the beginning of some of the description of the holidays there in Leviticus 23. That's a 23:4, where it says, "These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times." And then it goes in. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. Of course, these are Jewish months, which is not, the Jewish calendar has their own name for their own months. It doesn't, of course, coincide with the names that we use for months. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. 7 days, present an offering made to the Lord by fire. On the 7th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So this is a week-long Passover festival. And more about the Passover, just hold that for a minute and go over to Numbers 28 for a second. And there again, Numbers 28, more about the Passover. It tells you there what kind of offerings to make. 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and then add the grain, and on and on and on. And this is in addition to the regular daily offerings. And it talks about you do this for 7 days. And but what does a modern Passover look like? Well, some of you probably have either known Jewish friends or seen it in movies, but it is a time where the biblical description of here's what you're to do. And it's a way to remember the events of the Exodus. That's why you have a lamb. On the Passover, they took the blood of the lamb, remember, and put it on the doorposts as a way so that the angel of death would pass over the Jewish houses, the Israelite houses, and only strike the Egyptian. So, people eat lamb for Passover. They have no yeast. Not only for that meal, there is no yeast in the house. There is a ritual that happens in a Jewish house, at least a kosher Jewish house, right before Passover begins, where they do a ceremonial searching of the house for anything that has yeast in it. And so anything that contains yeast, any bread, any pastry, anything with yeast, has to be taken out of the house. Your house cannot have any yeast in it. And I know some Jewish families throw it away. I know some Jewish families box it up, give it to a Gentile friend to keep until the end of Passover, because it just has to be out of your house. And for 7 days there is no yeast. And the bread is matzah, which is the unleavened bread. And the actual Passover meal has, a certain set ritual, but it's not happening at the synagogue. It happens at each home, And the youngest child who's able to participate, the youngest, I think, reading child at least, says, "Why is this day different from other days?" And the father says, he actually says, "Our father was a wandering Aramean, Abraham. We, not they, we were slaves in Egypt." It's interesting that at the Passover they don't say our ancestors were slaves or they were slaves. We were slaves in Egypt. It's we, our community. And they go through the ritual and they have the roasted lamb, and they have a shank or a lamb bone that is scorched like it would have been then. There are various other foods, bitter herbs to remind them of the bitter labor, a sort of a mix of apples and nuts and different things. It's supposed to remind them of the mortar they used to make the bricks, and other foods on the plate that are all symbolic of something from the Exodus story. And so the Bible gives, this is what you're to do on the Passover, and you're to do it every year to remember. Now, the other holidays here that are kind of to be remembered is that 7 weeks after the Passover is another holiday called Shavuot, also called the Feast of Weeks, also called Pentecost. Pentecost, which means 50 days. Because remember, Pentecost is a Jewish holiday that something important happened in Christianity on the Jewish holiday of Pentecost. The coming of the Holy Spirit in the second chapter of Acts happened on the Jewish holiday of Pentecost, which means 50 days, which is the Feast of Weeks. It's called the Feast of Weeks because it's 7 weeks. It's 7 sevens, 50 days after the Passover. So you have it. And notice that is, whereas the Passover is a holiday memorializing the Exodus and the angel of death and the coming out of slavery, Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, Passover, marks the giving of the law, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the Torah on Mount Sinai. So it's a celebration of the giving of the law. And each of these holidays usually has an agricultural component too, matches a certain season of agriculture. Now, the next major holiday to talk about is Rosh Hashanah, which is New Year. Their New Year is, well, it's right around now, I think. I'm not sure. It is.
Yesterday.
Yeah, it was yesterday. Yeah. So it's Happy New Year, everybody. It's Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, but a week after New Year comes the most. If Passover is the most sort of important holiday, the most, I guess, sacred day, the day that would be more analogous to our Good Friday, is Yom Kippur. Okay? Yom Kippur means the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most solemn day of the year. And let's look what it says about the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. Okay? Leviticus 16. I'm not going to read this whole chapter, but here's the highlights of what happens on Yom Kippur, at least what happened in the Old Testament. Yom Kippur is the day in which the high priest would make offerings on behalf of the entire nation of Israel to atone for the sins of the people, to atone for the sins of the nation. So on Yom Kippur, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. It's the only day of the year that the Holy of Holies was in. All the other sacrifices take place outside of the Holy of Holies. But on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, the high priest would put on the priestly robe, he would part the curtain, he would go into the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant is, and he would offer a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant for the entire nation. And he would do something else that day. Now, I always thought, a little trivia, when he would go in there, especially later, they'd have a rope tied around him. And the reason they'd have a rope tied around him is if he dropped dead, they could pull him out. Because no one else could go in there. No one else could retrieve him. So they had a rope tied around him, so just in case he fell over dead, they could yank him out. And so he would offer. But one of the things he would also do, and this is, look at we're in Leviticus still, 16:20. Okay? He's sprinkled the blood of a bull on the mercy seat. They often refer to the lid of the Ark of the Covenant as the mercy seat. He sprinkled the blood on there. But look at 16:20. When Aaron has finished, Aaron, of course, is the first of the high priests. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall bring forth the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the desert in the care of a man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a solitary place, and the man shall release it into the desert. They don't kill the goat. He would put his hands on the goat's head and confess the sins of the nation. Then a man would lead the goat away from the tents and away from the people to the edge of the wilderness, and then send the goat out into the wilderness. What do we call that?
Scapegoat.
The scapegoat. The scapegoat. So, let's come into our modern parlance, our modern terminology. When you lay the blame on somebody, when somebody takes the fall, they are the scapegoat. They are the scapegoat. So that's what happens on the Day of Atonement. And of course, today, there are, of course, in Judaism, and we'll talk about this, of course, a lot, but in Judaism, just like in Christianity, we have denominations, we have Protestants and Catholics, we have Orthodox, we have conservative and liberal and moderate, and all kinds of things we talk about in Christianity. Well, Judaism has three major divisions. Orthodox Jews, which are very observant of the Jewish laws. Conservative, which are more modern, and then Reform, which are the more, quote, liberal. But even the more liberal or progressive or non-observant Jews usually observe the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. If they're only going to take one day off as a religious holiday, they're going to take off Yom Kippur. It is supposed to be a day. Modern, sacrifice animals, obviously. It's a day of fasting. It's a day in which Jews are to meditate on their sins. Think about, remember it happens a week after the new year, the new Jewish year. Think about sort of what we might call New Year's resolutions. You know, what am I going to do differently? How am I going to be a better person? It's a day for self-examination. But Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is that day of mourning in Judaism. Now, I might say, of course, they don't sacrifice animals anymore. Why not?
No temple.
There's no temple. Right. There's no place to do it. There hasn't been since 70 AD. There hasn't been a temple since 70 AD. And we'll talk about that at some point too. But just a spoiler alert, there is no temple in Jerusalem anymore. There's only one wall left of the temple. It's the Wailing Wall. It's the Western Wall. That's all that's left of the temple. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And that's when animal sacrifice stops. There has not been animal sacrifice by the Jews since 70 AD. But from the time of the tabernacle and the wanderings in the desert until 70 AD, animal sacrifice is how you worship. It is the method of worship for the Jewish people. Now, it's not quite as cut and dried as that, because there's times of exile and times where people couldn't get to the temple, people who live too far away, and other things that are, make that kind of worship impossible for some Jews. But if you live within a walkable, several day journey of Jerusalem, you were required to go there on the holidays and offer a sacrifice. These kinds of sacrifices, blood sacrifice, animal sacrifice, is instituted here in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and as a continual way of worship all the way through 70 AD, after the resurrection of Jesus. So, now let's talk about things that are a little more obscure, okay? And a little more unusual, because we've talked about the tabernacle, we've talked about the holidays, we've talked about the worship, but these books, if you read any of them, you'll discover there's just some odd stuff in there. And here's how I think, at least how I think we have to think about some of these things. Think about it like this. Think about, in our legal system, what is the basis of American law? The Constitution. Right? The Constitution, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. That is the foundation of American law. Now you might say, well, even that goes back to the Magna Carta, or, how far back do you want to go? But the Constitution is our foundation of our legal system. And anytime there's a question as to whether or not something is legal or not, what do they say? Is it constitutional? Right? Because any law that is not in accordance with the Constitution is thrown out. Right? So think about the 10 Commandments as being like the Constitution. These are the 10 bedrock statements of Jewish law. Worship only God. Don't make graven images. Don't misuse God's name. Obey, rest on the Sabbath. Honor your parents. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't covet. These are the 10 bedrock statements of Jewish law. But as we discover, even like say from the New Testament, one of the Jewish laws is don't work on the Sabbath. Well, what's work? What counts as work? How many pounds can I carry and it not be work? How many steps can I take and it not be work? Is cooking work? Is making a fire work? Is sewing a button on my shirt work? On and on and on. And what do we call those defining things? What do we call those? What would be, that's case law, right? I mean, you have a principle, but then you have to say, well, what does it actually mean? And what does it mean in this situation, in this situation, in this situation? And you spell out from the principle to case law. And that's what the Pharisees and were especially obsessed with, with the picky, I mean, they had defined it down to how many ounces you could carry, how many steps you could take. I mean, that's how much they had defined something like work and what counts as work. And not only are the laws in the Torah, in the Bible, but they have commentaries on those books, and then commentaries on the commentaries. The Talmud is a commentary on the scriptures, and the Mishnah is a commentary on the Talmud. And, we're talking hundreds of volumes of interpretation of law. A lot of what we see, I think, in the book of Leviticus, when Moses is up on the mountain, this is me, but we have page after page after page in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy of very specific legal situations. Like what to do if my ox gores your ox. What to do about the property lines between my territory and your territory. What to do if I have a rash and do I have to be quarantined? I don't believe that when Moses is up on Mount Sinai, God is saying, now, write this down. If you get a white rash on your thing, you need to be quarantined for this many days, etc., etc., etc. I don't believe those kinds of laws are part of what God dictates to Moses. I think a lot of what we have in the Old Testament of case law is the oral traditions as people began to say, well, given the Ten Commandments, what about this situation? How do we interpret it in this situation? And you end up with a lot of laws that the rabbis and the priests and the leaders tried to say, well, given God's laws, how does that apply to this situation? And how does it apply to this situation? And so a lot of what we see, I believe, in the Old Testament is not, Moses would have to have a whole rock quarry of tablets to bring down all that's here in the book of Leviticus. So let's think about some of these sections of the kinds of laws that these books have. Like Leviticus 12, for example. What I'm saying is, I don't believe that a lot of what we see in Leviticus is from the mouth of God. I believe that it is interpretations applying God's laws to everyday situations. So, here, for example, it talks about, after a woman gives birth, how long before she can go into worship. For example, if she gives birth, what kind of offering she has to make. And we know that Mary and Joseph have to do this after Jesus is born. Leviticus 13. When anyone has a swelling or a rash or a bright spot on his skin that may become an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to the priest or one of his sons who's a priest. And he's supposed to examine the sore. And if the hair on the sore is turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it's infectious. And then you'll pronounce him unclean. And if it's white but doesn't appear more than skin deep and the hair hasn't turned white, puts him in isolation for 7 days. And then on and on and on and on. I mean, this is what you do if somebody appears to have a skin disease. Well, this is just, what I would say, what comes out of community life in the desert and going forward. They're having to figure out what to do about how to control disease. And so they have regulations. They have regulations about these white spots on your skin that goes through almost all of chapter 13. Then you get to the end of chapter 13, and we've got a whole section on mildew. And again, I'm not picturing God up on Mount Sinai saying, now here's what you do about it. I believe that what this is priests and rabbis and others trying to take God's laws and then apply them to very specific situations. Then chapter 14, we're back to skin disease again. Then we're back to more mildew again. Then we're back to bodily fluid discharges in chapter 15. And about, what kind of fluids come out of you and what to do if you have a discharge of a fluid, and what is that, how long are you unclean? Now remember, the word unclean is, we hear the word clean and unclean and we think hygiene. They're not thinking hygiene. They don't have any understanding of germs or bacteria or any of those things. Clean and unclean means, can you enter the tabernacle or not? Can you participate in the religious services or not? If you have all these things, if you've got a skin disease, if a woman is on her period, etc., 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 you are unclean. You are not able to participate in the religious ceremonies for a set number of days. It has nothing to do with what we think of as cleanliness. It has to do with ritual impurity. Which is why, when we get to stories in the New Testament, and like the story of the Good Samaritan, and the guy gets beat up on the way to Jericho, he's laying there in the road, and the priest is walking by, and he walks on by. And we think, what a heartless guy. Well, yeah, but also, the guy looked dead. And if the priest touched him, he'd be unclean. If you touch a dead body, you're unclean and unable to go to the temple. And the priest would have not been able to do his job. So it's like safer to just not even just walk on by, because he would become ceremonially impure if he touched a dead body. So it's ceremonial, uncleanness. The word for clean, what is the word for clean in Hebrew? Like food that's clean. Kosher. Kosher. So, then, all these things about discharges, medical laws, now there's like food laws. Like Leviticus 11. Clean and unclean food. And again, this is not about whether it's been washed or this is about some foods are kosher, some foods are not kosher. And this gives us for animals right off the bat in Leviticus 11. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on the land, these are the ones you can eat. You can eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud. The animals you can eat have to have a split hoof or a cloven hoof and chew cud. And then, just in case you don't get it, they say, now, for example, there are some that chew the cud, but only have a split hoof, but you can't eat them. They have to have both. The camel, though it chews the cud, doesn't have a split hoof. It's not clean. The coney, which we're not sure, it's not talking about a hot dog with chili. We think it's a rock badger, although we're not sure. It chews the cud, but it doesn't have a split hoof. The rabbit, though it chews cud, doesn't have a split hoof. The pig has a split hoof, but it doesn't chew cud. So these are how you decide which animals are edible and which ones aren't. Then it goes on to sea creatures. They got to have scales. They have to have fins and scales, or they're unclean. That lets out shrimp, crab, lobster, shellfish, scallops. Jews can't eat any of those things. It tells you what kind of birds you can eat. And some of them, of course, we wouldn't want to eat, like eagles and vultures and ravens and owls. I'm not sure, we can't eat any of those. It tells you what kind of bugs you can eat and what kind of bugs you can't eat. For example, all the flying insects that walk on all fours are detestable. There are, however, some winged creatures that walk on all fours that you can eat. Those that have jointed legs for hopping. You can eat locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers. Yay, okay. And we have John the Baptist. It talks about he ate Locusts, right? So, all these food laws, they're here in Leviticus 11, they're in Deuteronomy 14, and people said, well, was this for hygiene or health? The only real decision, a lot of these laws, the only thing that really makes a lot of sense is to say, these laws said, you are different than the other Canaanites. You have separated yourselves from them. You have different kinds of laws. Now, since we're running out of time, a couple of the ones that people always point out. For example, Leviticus 19 tells us something about Judaism. Leviticus 19. There's some repetition of some of the main laws, but 19:19, Leviticus 19:19. Keep my decrees. Don't make different kinds of animals. Don't plant your field with two kinds of seed. Don't wear clothing woven from two kinds of material. I think we're probably all guilty of that one, right? You might say, well, why are these three things grouped together? You don't mix stuff. So many of the Jewish laws are about not mixing stuff. You don't mix your crops. You don't mix the material of your clothes. You don't crossbreed animals. And we're going to find out that, and we found this out both times that we've been to Israel, when we went with the pastor group and when we went with the church group earlier this year. Jews are allowed to eat meat. If it's a cow, it chews its cud, it has a cloven hoof, right? Chicken, whatever. They can eat meat. They can eat dairy. You can eat dairy. You can eat ice cream and milk, but you can't have them together. You can't mix meat and dairy together in Judaism. You can have one or the other. Yeah. Right. They would have, in an Orthodox house, they would have two completely separate sets of dishes, two completely separate sets of pots and pans, one for dairy, one for meat, and you can't mix them. When we went to Israel, a lot of people just kind of realize this, a meal would either be one or the other. You'd either have meat at the meal or you'd have dairy at the meal, but you wouldn't have both at the same time. Because you can't do both. So a Jew can have beef and a Jew can have cheese, but he can't have a cheeseburger. Because you can't mix meat and dairy. And you say, well, why? Well, look at all these laws. Don't mix anything. And I think the best explanation I heard of this is the food laws, the clothing laws, all these laws are enforcing the same basic principle. Don't mix. Because what was the thing they get warned about in Canaan over and over and over again?
Marry outside, Jerry.
Don't mix with the pagan people. Don't get mixed up in their religions. Don't marry their daughters and sons. Don't get pulled into their stuff. It's like every law is designed to reinforce the idea of stay separate. Don't mix things together. There's a way to remember, I'm not supposed to mix it up with the Canaanites. I'm not supposed to mix it up with the Hittites and Jebusites and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera-ites. So all these laws are about not mixing. Now, pointed out that often people bring up the fact that something else that's forbidden in Leviticus 19 is tattoos. 19:28. Yeah. But look what's forbidden in the verse right before it. Shaving for a man. You can't cut your beard. So,
They've been doing tattoos for a long time.
Huh?
You've been doing tattoos for a long time.
Yeah, we've been shaving for even long. I don't know, yeah, there's lots of things forbidden here, like shaving, that we as Christians don't follow. And the good news is, I remember reading some of this as a kid. I was like, oh my gosh, we're eating seafood and pork and all these things that are forbidden and all this stuff. Well, you get over to the Book of Acts, And they have this big council in Acts chapter 15 where they say, what about the Gentiles? Are we going to make them follow all these Jewish laws? You know, and there was some Christian leaders who had been Pharisees before they were Christians who said, yes, these Gentiles, these non-Jews, they need to obey every Jewish law. Food laws, clothing laws, don't shave, etc., etc., etc. And another group led mainly by people like Paul, who was Jewish, but who said no. You know, and Peter too, they said no, 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 we don't lay this on the Gentiles. And they ended up saying, well, we're going to tell them, okay, don't, stay away from sexual immorality and that, food that's been sacrificed to idols and pretty much that, just do those two things and you're good. And you don't have to obey all these other Jewish laws. And that's why we as Christians don't get bent out of shape when we read about, oh my gosh, I shaved this morning. Or my daughter has a tattoo. Or, 100 other things that seem to be, not only those kinds of things, but things, laws that are like, that even Jews don't obey anymore. Things like, if your son curses you, execute him. I mean, many of the laws here are, in case you're wondering, it's in Leviticus 20, verse 9. 20, verse 9 says, if anyone curses his father or mother, he must be put to death. And there's several places in the Bible that talk about that. There's other things that really are frankly troubling about, for example, Deuteronomy 22, and I shouldn't even point these things out because they're so troubling, but you might, Deuteronomy 22 basically says if a man rapes a woman and she's a virgin, he has to marry her. What do you think? That's not a good thing, that's not good. That's why I say I think we have to understand that much of these, what I would call case law, is not from Mount Sinai. It's not, thus saith the Lord. It is how the culture of the people of Israel across the generations began to figure out how they're going to live together. And, I'll leave you with this. And then we'll come back to this because this is a bigger topic all through the Old Testament. But in some ways, you think about the laws in the Old Testament. Some of them are moral laws. Don't kill. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't lie about somebody on the witness stand. Some of them are civic laws. If my ox gores your ox, then I have to give you this much money. Okay? There's laws like that in the Bible. Civic laws, property lines. If my animal hurts your animal, those kinds of things. And there are ceremonial laws, that have to do with, how do you, when you worship, make sure the altar is made out of rough stones and, da-da-da-da-da. We, on this side of Jesus, when we read the civic laws and the ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, we are not really in any way bound by those. About property lines or animals hurting another animal or, what kind of, whether or not you can trim your beard or whether you have to have tassels on your shirt, which is a law in here too. You have to have tassels on your clothes. If you've ever seen an Orthodox Jewish person, they have tassels on the edge of their garments. Yeah, and you can't cut your sideburns. You have to let them come down like that if you're a man. We're not bound by those ceremonial laws. We're not bound by those civic laws. And most modern Jews also don't feel bound by those. Only the most Orthodox Jews would still, and even they wouldn't murder their children, I think, if they cursed them. But it's the moral laws that we still have to pay attention to about killing and stealing and lying. And some of the biggest debates have to do with, well, Are these three really clear categories, or are some debatable which one of these columns do they fit into? And you know, it's funny how some people will pick out one one of these Old Testament laws and think that it still applies, and then ignore 20 others. And we'll talk more about that in the weeks ahead. How do we figure that out? How do we figure out if an Old Testament law still has any binding on us as Christians? Can you feel good about eating that shrimp, or or shaving, or getting that tattoo, or whatever else, or even some of the things that are in the laws that have to do with sex. Men are forbidden having sex with their wives during their periods. That's forbidden. And things have changed in a few thousand years about hygiene and all kinds of things. There's things that we say, how much of some of these laws do we still see as having any moral imperative, and how much of them would we say this was a civic law that organized a society, or a ceremonial law that was a part of that culture, that really is no longer relevant for our culture, especially on this side of the resurrection, on this side of Pentecost, Christian Pentecost. So we won't abandon that topic. We'll keep coming back to that. About if you want to know about a couple other, I don't have time to go into it, but if you're curious about a Nazirite, which is what Samson was, look in Numbers 6, and you'll find out what a Nazirite was. About cutting your hair and all that kind of stuff. So.